Okay. Let's start with your mother, maybe. Is that the best place to start?
Well, I was going to start with my father.
Okay, do that.
Is it recording now?
It is.
Well, I am Michael Moloney, and today is the 6th of November 2011. And I'm going to talk about the family as far back as I can go out of my head. I don't have any papers with me. Maybe I should have, but I don't. Anyway, my father, I thought I'd start with him. He was born on the 30th of January 1891. And he lived in Lombard Street in Galway, where his father, Martin Moloney, had a grocery and public house business, which was very successful. Now, I'll talk about Martin Moloney later on, but anyway, as far as my father was concerned, he was educated in Galway. I'm not sure what his primary school was, but eventually, anyway, he went to the university in Galway and did his first arts exam and passed it. But he had to leave the university at that stage because his father was paying for his brother, Joe, who was in Dublin studying medicine in a very haphazard fashion, and the father couldn't afford to pay for the two of them in university. So the father went to his bank, which was the National Bank, and he got a nomination for his son, Patrick Joseph, to get on the staff of the bank, which eventually was successful. And my father was appointed to the Gort, County Galway branch in 1910.
Was it hard to get into the National Bank at that stage?
Yes.
Did you have to do an exam, or how did you get
No,
in?
you had to be an acceptable person.
Okay, so it was about who you knew.
It was about who you knew. Exactly.
Okay.
So anyway, he was in the bank in Gort, and it was a very successful branch. Had a number of important customers like Lady Gregory, and when he came to visit Lady Gregory, W.B. Yeats, and also what's the name? It won't come to me at the moment. I'll think of it later on. But my father was quite a good musician. He played the violin and he also played the piano. And he used to go out and visit this man who had an organ in Tullyra Castle where he lived, and they used to play together. Now, what was his name? It annoys me that I can't remember. He was one of the founders of the Abbey Theatre.
And that Tullyra Castle was where he lived?
And he lived in Tullyra Castle. He was one of the very few Catholic landowners. Another one was a man called MacDermot, who lived in Mayo, and for whom my father's grandfather, Joe Dooley of Hetford, there again my memory is failing me. I have it in my little book. I'll tell you what it is now, just for the sake of the record.
Looking that up, I suppose that would mean that in 1901 your father would have been in Lombard Street, and in 1911 he would have been in Gort.
Yes.
Okay, so if one was checking the census, that would be the place to look.
But for some reason, he's in the 1911 census as shown as living in Lombard Street. Oh, the place was Cloghanover, Hetford. Joe Dooley had who was my father's mother's father, had a farm there of about 300 acres, I think, and he was quite well off. He acted as agent for this man, McDermott in Mayo, who again was one of these few Catholic landowners, and at some stage my father was sent to the branch of the National Bank in Hetford, which is very unusual because the bank had a policy of not sending their staff anywhere near the place where they were born and lived. But anyway, my father was sent to the branch in Hetford during the Civil War. And in each branch at that time, they had what was known as a character book. And in the character book was written very briefly notes on the customers and their situation and financial circumstances. And the one for Jolie, which had been written in the previous century, was good for £300 at any time. Now, £300 in 1880, let's say, was a very large sum of money.
It's a good annual salary for somebody, was it?
Yes. My father's salary, by the way, when he joined the bank was £40 a year.
And what grade or title would he have had at that stage?
He'd have been an assistant.
And how quickly, when he moved to Hetford, was that a promotion?
No, I don't think so, especially. I think he was moved to Hetford because the Civil War was on. They had great difficulty in finding people to go to places. So they transferred him to Hetford, where whether he was still in Gort at that stage, I'm not sure, because he was in Gort twice when he joined, and he was in it later on when he got married in 1922.
So he had a period from 1910 to 1922 when he was a single man, and I suppose he could have moved around quite a lot through different offices.
He was in Belfast in 1917. After that, he was in Belturbet for a short time, and then he was transferred back to Gort.
Belfast was not a nice place to be in, I would have thought, in 1917.
No, it wasn't a nice place to be.
Did he ever talk about that?
The only thing he talked about was, I suspect, but I have no proof, that he was actually quite involved in the national movement in 1917 in Belfast. He was the local representative of the bank's trade union, the Irish Bank Officials Association, and we have a commemorative silver tea tray and silver tea set which was presented to him when he was transferred out of Belfast.
So that was a newly established organisation, the IBI,
yes,
at that time?
It was a newly established organisation.
That
yes.
makes him one of the founders or one of
He
the very
was
earliest members.
one of the first local, if not the first local secretary in Belfast.
It's a risky thing to do.
In the National Bank in High Street, which is now has been sold by, well, it passed on to the Bank of Ireland on the amalgamation, and they have subsequently sold it, and it's no longer a branch of any bank. Anyway, I was telling you about Clonover. That's where Joe Dooley had the farm. And there are the only members of the family who are still in that area is a family called Morris. And they still, there's a sort of narrow little road runs from the main road to Clonover, which is far in off the main road, and the Morris family live on that road. I've met them once, but only once.
Are they farmers?
Yes. Now the Dooley land was eventually sold. And there was a lot of controversy about who owned it and who was to get the proceeds and all of that. My father wasn't involved in it, but I heard vague stories about it happening.
Right. To your father, I suppose, when you're saying he moved back to Headford, and that was odd because he came from that area.
That is right.
But Headford being near Gort, is that the point, or being near Galway City?
No, it's near Galway City,
near Galway
and his
City.
relations lived near Headford.
Yeah, right. Okay. And so it's the Dooley relations, so the bank would have known that he had relations in that area.
Yes, yes. It was one of the features of banking in those days that the branches knew everything about their local area and the people who lived in it, and about their families and their families' connections. It was all part of the job of being a bank manager, to know these things. And as I said, they were very briefly recorded in the character book.
Yeah. And by the time he got to Headford now, we're talking about the Civil War, what grade was he at that stage?
He was officially, he was an accountant. That's a sub-manager. And he, the manager in Headford was a Protestant. And he had to move out because of his religion,
Right.
which was no longer acceptable. And my father moved into the position of manager of the bank, although he wasn't officially a manager rank. But
was it a full branch or a sub branch?
Oh, it was a full branch.
It was a full branch, and that was during the Civil War. He had to move out. The old manager. It wasn't during the War of Independence.
No, it wasn't during the War of Independence. It was during the Civil War, and he actually, it was his practice to go home to Galway at the weekends.
This is your father's practice?
Yes.
Yes.
And he used to travel by bicycle, because of course there was no other way of going except that there was a steamer on the lake who used to regularly travel to Galway on the lake and the river, Corrib. And on this particular weekend, one of the, I presume it was the what do we call them? The irregulars.
Yes.
Had laid an ambush for him on the road to Galway, and he had chosen to go by the lake on this occasion, and so the ambush failed. But eventually, anyway, they occupied the bank in Headford.
They went to the bank
house.
anyway, even though they didn't get the key off him. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Yes.
They occupied the bank house in Wexford.
In Headford.
In Headford. And they were besieged there by the government, the official army. And eventually they were led by a man called Nestor, Captain Nestor. And eventually they planted a landmine on the front door of the bank, and they blew it open and rushed into the bank. And the irregulars rushed at the back and down the garden and over the back wall of the garden to escape. And Nestor and his men followed them. And Nestor shot several of them as they went over the wall at the back of the garden. He was in the house.
And he shot them as they reached the top of the wall.
He shot them as they went over the wall, yes. Now, whether he killed them or injured them, I don't know that detail of the story.
Have you any sense whether that was 21, 22 or 23?
I'd say it was probably 22, the year he got it.
And your father was, at this point, he was happily in Galway, probably completely innocent of the whole drama going on in Headford, was he?
Exactly, he was, yes. He
Safe
came
away
back.
from it.
He came back to Headford on the Sunday night to discover that the branch was in ruins
God.
nearly.
That's not very good care of your branch for the whole branch to disappear on you.
So, anyway, he got married in October 1922.
Just before you go on to that, I seem to remember you suggesting to me one time that one of the reasons why he might have got promoted was they were trying to move him away from the IBOA. Do you think there's any truth in that?
I think it could be quite possible. Yes, it was. Because he was very prominent in it in the early days. And as I say, I suspect that he was involved in the national movement in Belfast as well.
Yes.
Because the man who was De Valera's finance minister, Sean McEntee, was from Belfast.
Right.
And my father had no time for him whatsoever. And I suspect that there is a story behind that something went on which involved the two of them in opposition to each other.
I had a sense that he knew him well enough to have an opinion of him.
Yes.
He'd come across him.
Yes.
And that probably wasn't as a bank customer.
No, I would say. But the bank had two branches in Belfast, by the way. The one in High Street was the principal one, but they had one on the Falls Road as well. So they were quite deeply involved in the areas in Belfast where the national movement was at its height.
Yeah. The High Street one was a city centre one, was it?
Pardon?
The High Street one, didn't you say it was High Street?
Yes.
That was a city centre branch, I think.
Oh,
wasn't it?
yes.
So that wasn't in the nationalist area.
That wasn't in the nationalist area, and actually the manager of it was a man called Green. He was a Quaker, but very highly regarded in Belfast.
Yes.
Particularly amongst the Protestant community, of course. And it was the policy of the bank to be mixed as far as religions were concerned. They had a lot of Protestants on their staff, and they were quite prominent, and of course they had a lot of Catholics on it as well. But they kept a pretty even balance between the two.
It's not what you'd read in the history books now. If they were trying to divide, they would have put the Hibernian, let's say, and the Bank of Ireland as the Protestant banks, and the Munster and Leinster and the National Bank as Catholic banks. But you were saying they were mixed.
Well, the National Bank was.
Yeah.
But the other banks tended not to be.
Yes.
You know. But you see, the National Bank was founded by Daniel O'Connell.
Yes.
A great many of its customers were supporters of the repeal movement. So, consequently, a lot of them were Protestants.
Mm.
And the Protestants that were customers of the bank were very involved in the National Bank and very pro the National Bank. So it was a kind of bridge between the two sides in Ireland, which O'Connell himself was as well.
Mm. Do you think his experience, your father's experience between 1910 and 1922, Was it any way similar to your own experience in the 40s and the 50s and going around branches and working in different areas? Or was it very different at that stage?
Well, things had crystallised by that time,
Yeah.
you know, and there were very few Protestants in the bank when I was in it.
Yeah.
I don't think any of the branches that I was in, and they were quite numerous, had any Protestant staff. Some of them had lapsed Catholics, all right, but they didn't have Protestants on the staff to any extent in my time.
That's an interesting difference, really, because there's only 20, 25 years in the difference. And
Yes.
the idea that a whole religion, if you like, has taken out of a thing like the National Bank, not forced out, but just taken out, it shows there was a lot of change going on in that time in the bank.
Yeah, well, there was a whole lot of change going on everywhere in Ireland on a social level, because so many of the Protestant Unionists felt out of place in this new Gaelic Catholic state that had been established.
Yeah.
And they were leaving Ireland, and they left in droves, you know.
And do you think that affected the Galway area? Because you said there was a Protestant in charge of the Headford branch, and he had to leave the area at the time of the Civil War.
To that extent, yes, it did affect it.
And
yes.
possibly never came back.
Oh, he never came back. No. I heard his name, but I can't remember it now. Anyway, doesn't matter. Well, anyway, my father got married, as I say, and they was living in Gort.
That's in October
22.
October 22. Do you remember the date by any chance?
I don't know the date, actually.
Right. Do you know where he got married?
He got married in Limerick.
In Limerick?
Yes.
Why did he get married in Limerick?
Well, my mother was from County Clare.
Oh, yes.
And there's a very strong connection between her and Limerick.
Yes.
And for that reason, she was also involved at that time with her uncles in Tulla, County Clare, where her one uncle was local dispensary doctor, after whom I am called. He was Dr. Charles Moloney, and his brother was Willie Moloney. Willie was the shopkeeper, and Michael was the doctor. And they travelled in and out to Limerick a lot.
Okay.
And had a lot of connections, business connections,
Yes.
and social connections in Limerick.
So do you remember what church they got married in?
I can't recall the name of it now.
Did you ever look for a marriage certificate?
No, never. Never. Or I never saw one either.
Yes.
I don't even know whether they had a marriage certificate. Well, they must have had, because she wouldn't have been entitled to a pension from the bank without producing a marriage certificate.
Yes.
So they didn't.
They must have had one.
It existed all right, but I never saw it.
Where would he have met her, do you think?
Oh, they met in Gort. I was about to come to that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
We're talking about 1922. My mother was trained as a national school teacher in the Dominican convent in Belfast, strangely enough. And she had friends who came from Marafelt, although she had no connection with it at that time. But in any case, she had a number of positions, teaching positions, in County Galway and County Clare. And one of them was in Gort, or at least outside Gort, at Loughoutre Castle, which was occupied by the Gough family, the descendants of Field Marshal Gough. And they had a school for the children of the tenants on the castle land, and the headmaster of the school was called Concannon, and she was appointed as the assistant teacher in this school.
This would have been a primary school, I suppose, in effect, wouldn't it?
A primary school.
It probably would have taken them up to
a
11 or
national
12.
School, as
yeah.
it was called. And she was there. Now, where she lived, I don't know. I never heard that.
She could have lived on site, I suppose, it's possible.
She might have. She might have. But anyway, that's where they met. How they met, I don't know. I never heard the story, really, of their engagement or courtship. But anyway, they met there, and
so this is while they met because he had gone back to Gort again in what year had he gone back to Gort?
I don't know what year he went,
don't know what year he went back to Gort.
Time.
Around that time, yes.
Yeah.
And I suppose at that point, if he was going to Gort from Headford, he was already a branch manager, was he?
No.
Oh, he wasn't?
No, he wasn't. He was an accountant.
He was an accountant in Gort?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But I guess his salary would have increased significantly at that time to the £40 a year that he would have had originally.
Oh yes, it would have. I'd be guessing if I said maybe he had 150 a year.
Yes,
you know, or something in that order.
So in terms of the local population, I don't know much about the area, but in terms of the local population, he probably would have been a relatively well-off person.
Oh yes, yes. And the people who, I mean the Irish who were in and who lived in the surroundings were very poor.
Yes.
They're the people that Lady Gregory wrote the plays about.
Yes.
Because, for instance, Kiltartan Cross, which features in the plays, is on the other side of Gort, not on the Loughoutre side, but on the other side. And the people that she wrote the plays about, they were the people that lived in that area.
Yes, I can't remember if they still spoke Irish in that area.
I think the answer to that was, generally speaking, no. They would have known Irish, but I don't think they spoke it.
Yes. Did your father know Irish?
Purposes. Pardon?
Did your father know Irish? Because he was brought up in the city. It might be unlikely if he knew it.
He never gave any evidence to me that he knew Irish, actually. My mother did know some, but she had learnt it as an adult in the Gaelic League classes in Ennis. And of course politically they were very separated. She was very much a De Valeraite because of De Valera's connections with Clare and with Ennis in particular.
Yes.
And he was a complete opponent of De Valera and blamed him for the Civil War, which he considered was quite unnecessary.
Yes.